Okay, so today's focus is counter-controlled loops, specifically looking at for loops. So a couple of things to point out. Now, in the exam, okay, you will have quite a few counter-controlled loops shown to you, especially in paper 2. And these will always use what's known as a for loop. So this is the code on the left here. So the way it works is it is a normal loop, which will loop from a start value to an end value, and will have that increment. So the start value is here where it says a equals 1. That's the same as the counter-control loops we learn using while loops, and I've got that a equals 1 there. So the difference is that we actually will write it in the line, the for loop line, rather than write it just above it. Okay. Then it will have an endpoint. So in this case, we're going to 9, and the endpoint on this one is here. So with a while loop, excuse me, we'll use a condition. So in this case, while a is less than 10, we will loop. This one is while a is not got to 9 yet. Now you're probably thinking, well, why I've got 9 there and 10 there? Well, notice that I've got less than 10, so it won't include 10. This is the equivalent of saying, okay, less than or equal to 9. Okay, so it's essentially including the 9, so we'll print the 9 out, while this one on the right side would not, because it's not equal to. Okay, so that's that. Then we have next a. Now this probably maybe confuses a few people, but essentially what it means is go to next value. Okay, and next value is always plus 1. Okay, and that's the equivalent of this line here. So in a lot of ways, a for loop is a much simpler way of writing this counter-controlled while loop. Okay, so OCR will use for loops because they're a bit easier to read. Okay, once you know what you're looking for, and they're a lot shorter, and they will use that to write any kind of counter-controlled loop that they will use. So that's essentially what you're looking for. So let's look at a slightly more complicated for loop, okay? And when I say slightly more complicated, it's not massively more complicated. All I've done is added a little extra code to it to actually make it do something a bit more interesting, okay? So, like before, we need to work out when this loop starts and when it ends. They're the two main things that you need to know about a for loop. So in this case, it starts at the number 1 and it will stop at the number 5. And remember, it is going to include that 5 as well. So a will become 5 at some point. So with the print a, we're going to get the output 1, then 2, then 3, 4. Sorry, it's a bit slow for me to do this on a trackpad. We need to get myself one of those fancy pens, don't I? And 5. Okay. So that's going to print out 1 to 5. Okay, and remember the next a is the same as a plus 1. Okay, so a equals a plus 1. But now I've got this total equals total plus a. Well, what's going to happen here? Well, a total starts with 0. So when a is 1, okay, total is going to become 1 because 0 plus 1 is 1. So it's going to initially be 1. Then when it loops, a is 2. Well, 1 plus 2 is going to become 3, isn't it? Then it's going to move on to the next one. So a is now 2. Well, total is 2. Sorry, total is 3, and a is 2. So 3 plus 2 is 5. And that will keep going, adding on a each time until we get to the end of the loop, and then it will do the printing at the end. Okay, so there's a lot of similarities between the while loops that we use all the time and the for loops. Let's actually look at those similarities. Okay, so remember this will have a starting value. Okay, so a will start off as value 1, and here we start off a equals 1. Then we'll stop at 5, and this one will stop when a is no longer less than or equal to 5. Okay, so while that's true, we'll loop. Okay, notice this time I have put equals to 5, so it's going to include the 5 like it does here. So remember that is equal to 5 when it stops. Then the 2 lines of code here are identical. Okay, so what's inside it, the kind of you can imagine that this is like a sandwich. That's my slice of bread. That's my slice of bread, and that's my inside of the sandwich. And then we've got the a equals a plus 1, so moving on to that next value. Okay, and that's what this next a is doing, plus 1. So they do exactly the same thing. The for loop is shorter, okay, and in some ways a lot easier to understand. As long as you remember it has a start value and has an end value, and the next a always adds 1. Okay, so the exam will always represent counter loops, so those loops which are predictable, which will have a clear start, a clear end. They'll always use for loops. Okay, they will especially use it if they're using arrays, because arrays will start the first item in the array, that goes to the last item in the array. So if they're ever showing a loop with an array, it's always going to be a for loop. Okay. So that's essentially all you need to know for that one. So in terms of how you write code in the exam, well, absolutely fine. You can use either. Okay, so if you want to write your while loops using what we've been practicing for 2 years, yeah, of course you can. Absolutely. If you want to use the OCR reference language, which is what it's called, and use that for loop, yeah, of course you can. That's not a problem at all. Okay, you do what you find easier. The only thing I will say is you have to be able to read this code. So if you see it, know what it means. Okay, you don't have to write it. Okay, you do not have to write it. You can write the way we've always written it there. Okay. Okay, and just the last thing to say is why don't we use for loop? Okay, why on earth would we have to learn while loops instead? Okay, well, the reason why is Python doesn't have for loops really, not in the same way as the OCR reference languages. Okay, so this bit of code here that I've shown you already, okay, this is how you'd write it in Python using a for loop. So for loops do exist in Python, but they just work really differently. I'm not going to spend ages explaining the exact intricacies of how for loops work in Python. What I will say is just look at it. It's much different, isn't it? You've got this for a in range 1 to 6. So it doesn't even have the thing where this one will end and include 5. You actually have to add 1 to it. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So that's the reason why I don't teach you this, because you know what, it's confusing enough, isn't it, ladies and gents? And I don't want to confuse you more by saying, well, this is how we do it in Python, but actually this is what it's going to look like in the exam. The while loop looks a lot more similar than that does, which is the reason why. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. Have a go at the exam questions, ladies and gentlemen. If you do have questions, please talk to your members of staff, or if you can't get hold of them, obviously you can send an email to me. I'm more than happy to answer your questions.